I am hoping that I'm speaking to a group of Republicans overseas, sponsored from Germany, but including people in many countries and many time zones. So I thank you all for joining us at this time. I've been advised by the convener, Kerry Rediger, that I should start with a perspective of mine as someone who's just published a book about President Trump on that subject, emphasizing some areas that I think have been largely overlooked by his extremely numerous and vocal critics. And then after I've inflicted myself on you for a few minutes, I will open the meeting up for back and forth, and then we can see where it goes from there. As you all know, President Trump is an extraordinarily controversial person. It is the nature of his office that it would be a matter of controversy, but not since the latter days of the Nixon presidency do I recall any holder of that office being quite so contentious a figure. I'd like to make a few points to explain in matters that are not disrespectful of him as an individual or lay at his doorstep, as many are wont to do, sociopathic tendencies of which he's in fact not guilty, in my opinion, to explain from my perspective and on the basis of my research some of the reasons for this state of affairs. We must remember that he, in effect, as a citizen, declared war on the entire political class of the United States. He attacked all factions of both parties. He attacked the Hollywood role, the Wall Street role, the lobbyists, the special interests, the campaign financing techniques, and the national political media. He attacked them all. He said they were all a swamp. They were all rotten, not every single individual, but all sections of that complex that effectively governed the United States in the post-Reagan years, and that they had failed. He attacked the Bushes as much and as vigorously as he attacked Obama and the Clintons. And he held both parties in both branches of government, and to some extent in the judicial branch as well, responsible for 4 terms and possibly 5. The second Clinton term was not particularly accomplished either, of collective, congestive, self-aggregating failure in almost every relevant field. In that period, the metric I like to use is GDP growth per capita. It went from 4.5% under President Reagan to 3.9% under President Clinton to 2% under George W. Bush to 1% under Obama. And the trend is clear, and as you all know, there was an increasing number of Americans who were extremely anxious about the failure throughout this new century to better their lot. They worked just as hard or harder, but their take-home pay or the buying power of their pay did not increase. And they were both frightened and angry in very large numbers. But at the same time, as this flatlined economy, we had practically the entire conventional ground forces military capability of the United States mired in the Middle East for over a decade in conflicts from which the United States suffered eventual strategic disadvantages. A large part of Iraq effectively fell under the influence of Iran, and then there was a giant humanitarian crisis causing millions of desperate refugees to flee for their lives. And this, while it's painful for Americans to face this, is essentially largely to be laid at the door of the United States and both parties in the United States. It was a time of spectacular debt. I mean, we had the greatest recession and economic crisis in 80 years, followed by, in the Obama years, an increase on the debt that was accumulated on the day he was inaugurated after 233 years of American independence. The debt increased by 125% in 8 years. And there was great dissatisfaction with the foreign and strategic policies in that period, from George W. Bush's, as it was perceived, rather helter-skelter militarism plunging aggressively into conflict, and on the other side, the passivity and somewhat Panglossian naivety of the Obama era, imagining that America's enemies would become their friends if they were just treated differently. Under President George W. Bush, we had the championship of democracy that led to the election of Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and eventually the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, although the West dodged that bullet. But that's what happens when you promote democracy in places where the favored party on a democratic consultation basis is apt to be anti-democratic. But that hadn't been thought through, and neither had the effective and unannounced, rather surreptitious withdrawal from from the world by the United States of the Obama era. I mean, the pivot to Asia wasn't really a pivot to Asia. It was a pivot to Fort Bragg. The U.S. just withdrew. And if you don't stage a withdrawal, and obviously withdrawals are good things if you're overextended, but if you don't stage it and prepare it properly, you create vacuums that undesirable elements are apt to fill, and that's effectively what has happened. So what Trump had undertaken was an assault upon the entire system, a completely nonviolent revolution, asking his countrymen to say, look, this system is broken down and we've got to change it completely. Now, obviously, everybody who felt threatened by this objected to it. Now, at the beginning, he was disparaged, and you all remember it, I'm sure. It was a joke. His campaign was a joke. The whole idea of Donald Trump, this overblown carnival character, being elected president was unthinkable. And it was, for those of us who watched it closely, a startling and extraordinary thing to see the evolution of people's responses to him as the process of consulting the public proceeded through the primaries. Pardon me from time to time, just for a second, as I take a sip of water. I'm taking an anti-cold medicine that makes me thirsty. Thank you. In this process, again, I think we have to remember that Trump had conceived, and he'd been thinking about it a long time. I know this because I've known him for 20 years, and he was polling even before I knew him. He always had the thought that celebrity could be translated into high political office. And he had the view that practically all publicity is, for those purposes, good publicity, because in the United States, there are always some people who like highly publicized figures, even if it's negative publicity. And he steadily expanded his reach demographically in the country. He promoted prize fights. He became involved in these extraordinary spectacles of wrestling matches where he ended up shearing the hair off the head of the World Wrestling Federation when his sponsored wrestler, in an undoubtedly rigged match, defeated the other man's. Mind you, he rewarded the head of the WWW or WWF, Vince McMahon. He rewarded him by appointing his wife the head of the Small Business Administration. But he gradually became not just a billionaire and a television star, but a sort of populist figure right down into blue-collar and rural areas. And nobody had any idea why he was doing it other than a love of self-promotion and novel ways of making money off a brand. And indeed, in straight commercial terms, what he was doing was extremely original also. But I think we have to remember that this tendency to dismiss him as an underachiever to be elevated to his present great office is not fair. I put it to you, to all of you, that he achieved more prior to being installed as President of the United States than any previous holder of that office except Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Grant, and Eisenhower. He made billions of dollars in very difficult industries. He came back from a technical insolvency very quickly to greater wealth than he'd ever had before. He set out to become a television personality, and from his first appearance, for 15 years, he always led the ratings. He had over 25 million viewers every night for 15 years, every week that he appeared. I guess 50 times a year for 15 years. Only 2 nights when he did not top the ratings at all that time. That was when particularly interesting people were on American Idol. I mean, I don't watch these television programs. I never saw one television program Donald was on, but that isn't the point. If any of us announced to ourselves we were going to become huge television stars, it's unlikely we'd be very successful at it. Certainly, speaking for myself, it's unlikely. But he did it, and then he became the only person in the history of the United States to be nominated by a major political party for president without ever having held or sought any public office, elected or appointed, and without ever having held a serious military command, with one exception. That can be said also of the Republican candidate in 1940, Wendell Willkie. But there was no chance of beating Franklin D. Roosevelt, which is Willkie's task. He ran a good campaign, but Roosevelt was invincible. Donald Trump won in a year when the Republicans had a good chance to win. And again, contrary to, and we all remember, virtually all expectations, he did win. So that combination of achievements, his wealth, his innovation in the celebrity area, his accomplishment of becoming one of the country's great television stars, his gaining control of a major political party, and in fact being elected president. These are astounding achievements. It wasn't an astounding achievement for General Grant or General Eisenhower or General Washington to be president after what they'd accomplished prior to that, but for Trump it was. And I think we have to recognize that while I believe the controversy about him is less intense now than it was a year ago, and the talk of imminent impeachment and so forth has largely subsided, and he has turned the tables and is now pouring great doubt and in fact doubt involving legal danger, prosecution on those who tormented him. The country is getting used to him. His numbers have risen. His administration has, and I'll get to this in a second, in the abstract, been quite successful. And he himself has become a less bumptious personality, like all of us, and in any activity, the more you do it, in general, the better you get at it. But this war that he declared against the political class continues. He won control of the Republican Party. He won the presidency. But for the first 6 months, the Republican delegations in both houses of the Congress just sat in their hands. They gave him an absolute turkey of a health care bill. They gave him no support at all. And they were waiting as if they held the balance of power between the Democrats and the president to see if he was for real or would be impeached. And all of that is over. All the never-Trumpers are going, but 30 of them aren't running again, like Paul Ryan and Senator Corker and Senator Flake. And he has rock-solid control of the Republicans now, and they're in lockstep behind him trying to get his program through. And so it'll be on to the next phase of this war. But in the meantime, he's appointed a great many judges, and he has had a successful term to date. The Treasury expects in the next quarter economic growth of the astonishing figure of 4.8%. Whatever anyone may say about the North Korean activities, he has got the Chinese to cooperate in a way they did not with Trump's predecessors. And the leader of North Korea recognizes quite clearly that he has a choice, a triumphal, completely unembarrassing welcome into the world, end of sanctions, end of the official state of war, end of official ambitions to unification, no regime change, and considerable economic aid to assist one being the Deng Xiaoping of North Korea, if that's what he wants, and assurances of his security. And on the other side, the United States possesses the military option, and contrary to the fear-mongering that goes on, it would be a relatively easy matter, and an extremely short time would be required for it, for the very heavily reinforced 7th Fleet with 3 Nimitz-class carriers to take down all the relevant military targets. They could hit the artillery emplacements in the hills just across the frontier aimed at Seoul with a barrage of cruise missiles that would decalibrate them. And the actual nuclear targets are only about 10 or 12 sites, and it certainly would not be difficult for the the sea-launched aircraft of the U.S. Navy to dispatch them all, and it could all be done in 1 minute at the same time. And that option is real. And this is a great achievement, that he's got to this point, and he knows as a skillful negotiator, instead of simply humiliating the North Koreans, to give them a very good option on its own merits. I'll just finish up a bit of a summary here and throw things open so we can all, I can hear what some of you think of it. But one of the great issues, of course, has been and remains immigration. Now, it's hard to get exact numbers, but he's cut illegal immigration by approximately 50%, and they are working towards some sort of a deal that is going to emerge from that terribly complex process. But the fact is the Democrats have almost backed themselves into the corner of supporting open borders. Anyone comes in, clogs the welfare rolls, the education system, and the law enforcement apparatus, and they can vote whether they're citizens or not. Census takers are to be discouraged or even prohibited from even asking if someone is a citizen. Bear in mind that the Constitution leaves it to the census to determine the delegations of each state to the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. And we have this absolutely preposterous spectacle of sanctuary cities where mayors of the greatest cities, New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and many others, are declaring that they will ignore federal law on these matters and encourage the police to do so also. Well, this is the beginnings of the breakdown of government, and it is certainly not where public opinion is. This is not immigration of the kind that is celebrated in the Statue of Liberty, where individuals or families decide to move to another country and get on in that country and become citizens of that country and adopt it as their country. This is a wave of unnumbered, unnamed people simply moving en masse in a direction where they happen to cross a border and occupy the area that they've moved into. And that isn't immigration. That's like it's obviously on a modest scale, but it is like the sort of population flows that announced and provoked the end of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. Well, we aren't at that stage, and I don't raise that to be alarmist, but the fact is that is what he's dealing with, and the public are going to support him. He has a political genius for hitting the hot buttons in a way the public likes that the elites simply didn't notice. It is the fact that nobody in either party, in the hierarchy of either party, had the faintest idea of how much discontent there was in that country, and it is illustrative of their incompetence to continue to rule that they did not know that. But it being a democracy, it's settling it in a democratic way. I'll add one final point, if I may. On this North Korea thing, it is a little recognized fact that Donald Trump is the only hope left for the non-proliferation system. The non-proliferation system was always essentially hypocrisy. It was a club of nuclear powers urging others in moralistic tones not to join that club, but when they chose to do so, they were accepted, even ones that could conceivably be unstable and therefore dangerous, Pakistan in particular. But obviously the Americans could not really stop Stalin from it. They had no reason or right to try and stop the British or the French, despite the outrageous things Mao Zedong used to say about surviving a nuclear war. It wasn't a practical thing to try and prevent him from joining, nor India after China joined, nor Pakistan, nor Israel. But the United States has taken the position under this president that he would not tolerate the accession to the nuclear club of somebody in the regime that routinely threatened to obliterate its neighbors. And this president has made it clear that he considers that the same rules apply to the theocracy in Iran. And he is not, by nature, a disarmer. And let us face facts that it is only the power of the deterrence coupled to the rise in the hands of the Americans and to a slight degree the Russians of defensive anti-missile weapons that has preserved the peace. So if we all disarmed, we would put ourselves at the mercy of people like Kim Jong-un and the Khamenei and the other ayatollahs. But he is at least outlining a policy in which accession to the nuclear club isn't simply an open door to anybody who wants to do it, because what has to be done to make a nuclear weapon is widely known, and most of the countries in the world could do it if they wanted to. Delivery systems become more complicated, of course, but that is the last hope for any non-proliferation strategy, and is probably among the last things Donald Trump will get any credit for. But he deserves the credit for it. I think I've spoken quite long enough, so I'm going to, if I haven't taken leave of my memory completely, I'm going to do the necessary to make this an interactive call. So if it doesn't happen, I'm sure I'll be hearing from Kerry. But here we go.
So, Mr. Black, you hear in the background the football match is going on right now against Portugal and Spain. So that's a little bit of the horns going on right now. As you know, we have the World Cup. First, I want to thank you very, very much for the information and getting us motivated here in Europe and around the globe right now, listening to you. We have a lot of questions. I chose actually two. And I want to ask you two questions, and if you would be able to answer them, that would be great. We have one question from Hong Kong and one question from Bad Homburg in Germany. And the first question is Mr. Black, I know your book is called A President Like No Other, and Donald J. Trump is unique, but which past presidents would you compare him to? Some have said Teddy Roosevelt, others have said Andrew Jackson. Do any of these comparisons hold up?
To a degree, Teddy Roosevelt in his big stick foreign policy, but he really brought the U.S. onto the world stage as a great power, building the Panama Canal and expanding the Navy. He was very judicious in his use of it, as Trump has pledged to be. He's not a military adventurer. So there is that aspect. I think also some of the trust busting and so on. Trump is no pillar of Wall Street. Wall Street never liked him, and he never liked them. Although he's, of course, an extremely wealthy man. But he didn't make his money in the capital markets. Jackson, to the populist part of it, certainly, and the idea of enfranchising the people better and opening the government up and the spoils system, as it was called, but where Jackson essentially got rid of a large part of the civil service and who he thought were essentially corrupt and over-complacent in their offices, and revoked the charter of the Bank of the United States. These were very populist and slightly revolutionary things. So there are aspects of that, too. Now, both of those men were military men. Roosevelt was a colonel and rose to prominence because of his role in the Spanish-American War. And, of course, Jackson was a general of volunteers, and his greatest victory was the Battle of New Orleans over the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law. But Trump was not. He went to a military academy, but his background and his conduct personally is very different. I mean, he was quite a figure on the nightclub scene in New York, and has had a much publicized, and prior to his present marriage, a very active romantic life. But I would say there are elements of those. I'd say a few others as well. There's a bit of President Truman's his identification with the middle class and middle class tastes and middle class values, and a total absence of snobbery that I'm not sure you would have got that with Theodore Roosevelt exactly. Look, when it is like no other, I mean it is like no other, but there certainly are aspects of the ones that you mentioned, and I think Mr. Truman to a degree, and also to a slight degree Lyndon Johnson. He was the closest to a businessman, I think, of those who preceded Trump as president. He was a wealthy man. He used his political position to enhance his economic interests, not in an illegal way, but in a way that would be seen as controversial now, retaining a television monopoly in Austin, Texas, and so on. But he had that wheeler-dealer nature, and of the previous presidents in that sense, as a deal maker, LBJ would be the model. That's, I think, the best I can do, Karen.
Thank you, sir. And the second question we have is President Trump's consensus of the crumbling of post-Cold War order, or his action based exclusively, or an instinct?
I wouldn't say the crumbling of the post-Cold War order exactly, but a shuffling of the deck. He came to the conclusion, partly on the basis of his international business activities, that the former system simply had to change and was changing, and the changes had to be recognized. He felt that NATO was not pulling its weight, that it wasn't really all for one and one for all. It was, with a few exceptions, the British, the Poles, the Estonians, and to some degree, a couple of the others. It was the other countries graciously consenting to have the United States guarantee their military security, while the Americans paid the bills and did all the work. As I've written before, their conception was to treat the United States like a great Saint Bernard. They would hold the leash and give the orders, and the Americans would do the work. And Trump didn't want the alliance to fail. He wanted it to be reconstructed on a basis of proper, full joint participation in burden sharing, and possibly a revision of objectives. And he didn't think that there was necessarily a strategic rivalry with Russia now that it is no longer a superpower and half its population has vanished from under the Kremlin's authority, and the strategic interests, the legitimate interests of Russia and the United States need not conflict very much, and so he has given it some analysis, and but he also, you're quite right in the gentleman I mentioned from Hamburg, that he has an instinct in it, and I can say this of your former fellow German, Dr. Kissinger, who's been a friend of mine for many years, and I speak with him often, and he says that, well, President Trump is not overly versed in the history and geography of most foreign countries. He does have an instinctive grasp of where their interest is, and he does have a very good reading of their leaders when he meets them. And after he came from a meeting with Merkel, for example, Chancellor Merkel, his comments on what her motives were and what she wanted were exactly accurate, not because she had spelled them out with precision. He is a very astute man, and he's a personality that varies according to the occasion. He is, for someone who knows him, often quite difficult to recognize in this rather over the top and exaggerated public personality that we see. So he he adjusts his own personality according to what he's trying to achieve and who he's trying to achieve it with.
Perfect. My last question, my personal question, for all of our German listeners out there also, today it came out in the Politico, Angela Merkel's political near-death experience in the Bavarian brawl against the CDU and the CSU. And the question is Seehofer going to hold on, as you're aware of the fight that they're having right now?
Yeah, I'm aware of it, but I'm sure others on the line would be better qualified than I to predict the outcome. I would assume that the federal chancellor can still work it out. She's obvious. She hasn't lost her talents, but it is clearly a fatigued and beleaguered government, and all governments come to an end. But my guess is that she'll maintain her position, but that's not. I have to emphasize, I don't know enough about it to state that with great confidence.
No problem. Well, listen, Lord Black, I really appreciate everything from you, and I want to also thank Tina Chitton for tracking you down, and it's a very great honor for you to address us. As you know, we're living in a very hostile environment here in Europe, representing the Republicans and the conservative views. And I really want to thank you from my deepest, and I hope we're able to get you again on the line, sir.
Gary, thanks so much. The honor is mine. I'll just say this. I am, as you mentioned, a member of the upper house of the British Parliament, and I am half in Britain, and I've had a number of public debates there on the subject. I know how difficult it is to present Trump as in any light other than the caricature of him that the media, including most of the media of the United States, inflict upon him. But time is on our side. He is delivering. While he does engage in a good deal of exaggeration, in my experience of these things, which goes back to the Eisenhower era, no president has more faithfully delivered after election what he promised to do before the election. And his opponents have no program at all except character assassination of him. And we had the illustration yesterday in the Inspector General of the Department of Justice's report that his enemies are in fact a bunch of unindicted criminals, and they are not going to be unindicted much longer. Now, I don't say that out of partisanship, but the rot that crept into the government of that country is shocking. And if Mrs. Clinton, I am not a Clinton basher, and I have nothing against the Clintons, and Bill Clinton's been a friend of mine since he was the governor of Arkansas, and I own newspapers there. But if they had been elected, this all would have been swept under the rug. And if they had just left Trump alone and given him a honeymoon, he never would have raised up any of it. But they confected this nonsense that he had been in league with the Russians to rig an American election, accusing him in effect of treason, and they're going to pay for it. That is a false charge, and they're going to pay for it. And those amongst whom you navigate in Europe or in the Far East who smugly tell you you Republicans, what an idiot of a president you have. Just stick to your guns. History is on Donald's side. He is a strange cat, but he's going to win. He always wins, and he's going to win.
Good. We'll end it with that, Mr. Black, and thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon, and we'll be in touch with you, sir. Okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye, Mr. Black. Ciao, ciao.